Hey, good afternoon, Tim. How are you today?
Good afternoon. I'm doing very well.
We've been doing this podcast for, is this number 25? I was trying to think, where are
Y-
we?
This is number 25. You're right.
So if it ends in a zero or a five, that means it's some sort of milestone, right?
That sounds good to me.
So listen, I was looking over some of the information that we wanted to talk about today, and I know that we were dealing with, or we were thinking at some point we wanted to get into the new PMBOK version 7, the new guide 7. And it occurred to me that I shouldn't be surprised, but the Project Management Institute, what it would be from our perspective as project managers, they under promised and over delivered. Because
Right.
my understanding was this new version wasn't supposed to be out till August 1st, and here we are in July, and we've got it.
There was an early release. It surprised me too. One of my students about 3 weeks ago said, "Did you know that?" No, I did not. And now I do. And this is wonderful.
So I was looking through it briefly, and I know you mentioned to me earlier off air that you've had some time to kind of spend in and kind of get involved in exactly kind of the things that they're doing. And I was thinking from our listeners' perspective, it's a new edition, it's a new release. Typically, there's some major or substantial changes, but from my cursory review of just some of the subject matter, it looks like there's a fairly large change this time.
It's funny. It's like you're on a trip and all of a sudden you decide to change suitcases and you put all of the things in the old suitcase in the new suitcase and it's reorganized. Let's keep that allegory in place as we go through this discussion, because even though it looks like it's different and it's talking about project management in a different way, let's talk about what the similarities are as well as the differences.
That sounds good, except, I'm having a hard time relating to your allegory because having spent 30 years on airplanes, 4 million miles, I rarely carried a suitcase. Everything with me was carry on and move. But anyway, yes, we will go with that allegory. I just had to kind of get that in there. But from, from what I was reading, the old way, and I complained about this vehemently, although I followed it, the old PMBOK versions up through 6 were very much process based or process oriented. This one has a different tilt to it. Can you elaborate on that? Something about principles or?
Yeah, actually, let's actually step back. Okay.
Yeah.
There are two pieces to the project management body of knowledge. Okay. There's a standard, and the standard says this is what project management is, and this is what it's about. It's the big picture. Okay. And in the 6th edition, that's the second part.
Okay.
And it looks at how we approach initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, controlling, and closing. Basically, that's what it says. Here's what these mean, and here's what you do. It's a very prescriptive how and what, right?
And from a project manager's point of view, we love prescription.
Right. Oh, that's exactly right. And when you get into the guide says, here's the standard. Here's what initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, controlling, and closing does. The guide says, in initiating, this is what you do. In planning, this is what you do. In executing. So in the guide, that's where you get to the knowledge areas, your scope, schedule, cost, your quality, resources, communication, your risk, your contracts, your stakeholder, and then integration, tying it all together. And you have 49 processes. A process is, by definition, actually, I like to carry 2 definitions of processes with me. Number 1, a series of actions or steps taken in order to achieve a particular end. I had to read that off my notes. It's you get something as a result of doing something. You have a certain amount of tasks. and it takes an input and applies those tasks and generates an output. So in each one of these knowledge areas and across all of these process groups, there's 49 groups of tasks we call processes. And you're right, it's very prescriptive. And it's, when did you start exploring the framework, by the way, Merv?
Probably back in about PMBOK 4 is when I got serious about it. When I got into PMBOK 6, though, you recall that we've talked a lot about my blogging in the past on my website. You mentioned 49 processes in the PMBOK 6.
Mm-hmm.
And you also are aware, and we're going to get into this shortly, is that I'm very much more people-oriented than I am process-oriented.
Let's keep that in mind.
Let me just finish this thought here, because you mentioned 49 processes, right? So I took those 49 thinking I can do 49 over a whole year, but I need 52. So I stretched a couple, I put an opening and a closing, and I stretched the couple out, and I ended up with 52 blog posts 3 times a week. So 156 blog posts on PMBOK 6 in the process from a people-oriented perspective. So yeah, go ahead and talk about what you were just going to say. Yeah.
Let me show you something.
All right.
So 1999 was the first time that they published the project management body of knowledge. And then they turned around and they said, here's the 2000 guide. This came out, and I got this in 2002, actually. And you notice it's a little skinnier than the 6th edition, isn't it?
Yes, much skinnier.
And it didn't have anything in it. In fact, it wasn't until the 4th edition they pulled 2 processes out of communication. And from those, they added a couple more processes and created stakeholder management. So this group of processes in this framework has been continuously evolving. This is not a static structure. And if you can actually get your hands on all the PMBOKs, they tell a history of how and why these changes occurred. And it's fascinating reading. Maybe that's something you and I can talk about in the future.
So maybe it is. And I'm struck by what you're saying in terms of its evolution. But it seems to me that starting in when I got more serious about the PMBOK itself in version 4, going from 4 to 5 to 6, and I read these pretty deeply. My sense was still it was very much process oriented.
Oh yeah.
Now for me, coming from what we call the predictive or the waterfall methodologies, which is what I dealt with all my life, I could see that the PMBOK probably evolved from waterfall or predictive as opposed to the other way around. Would I be fair in saying that, or would I be off base?
No, that's pretty close. That's pretty close. Let's talk about a couple other things that happened right around the time they released the 6th edition. One of the things they did back in 2015 was work with the Standish Group and do a lot of surveys. I'm talking about Project Management Institute. And they found out that corporations and project managers said, we got it all wrong. Processes are great and they do great spreadsheets, but you can get all the great spreadsheets in the world and you miss what the stakeholders need.
Yeah.
And so they started, looking around and discussing. And one of the things that PMI did was create a relationship with the Agile Alliance. And so in 2017, they released the Agile Practice Guide, which is in combination with the Agile Alliance. It was not created inside of PMI. It was created between these 2 great organizations. So what they learned out of this was that, so predictive projects by definition mean I can follow a plan and the plan's going to make me successful. But in Agile, it says I have relationships, and the relationships I develop are what make the project successful. So they said they had to they had to overhaul the body of knowledge. And so what they did was, how do we actually do this? And in your own terms, people first, convert this process guide into a people guide. And that's what we're getting into here.
Well, and that made sense to me, because I would get so frustrated as a project manager, because even managing projects for my vendor company, I still was the cheerleader for the client, because I felt we were there to make sure that the client was satisfied, that their objectives were met, that we came in on time and on budget, we didn't misuse their funding, and all of that. And it just seemed to me that my bosses, a lot of times, or my coworkers, had the schedule on the wall, and they would tick the box, the checklists, and they were saying, look, we're getting done, we must be getting done. And I felt like we were never really treating our client as a true partner. And in many ways, we were often not treating our own staff as true partners in the entire endeavor. So that's where my 156 blog posts came, was basically cheering on the people within the process itself. So when I saw this, I was ecstatic. I wasn't jumping up and down. I'm not that kind of guy, but I was ecstatic to see the turn that PMBOK 7 took.
So yes. And now let's start talking about the details, because the details are what gets really interesting. Let me bring up my screen so we can look over. This is just before the beginning of the standard. Okay, now if you look at the left hand side, you see the contents and the structure of the 6th edition, and if you look at the right hand side, you look at the structure and contents of the 7th edition. One of the biggest change was they put the standard first instead of second in the new edition, and they put the guide second. That's the first thing that's really weird.
So for those people who are listening to us and don't have the benefit of this visual, we just have to say at some point they will get the benefit of this visual when it's published. But in the meantime, we'll be very descriptive in how we explain it.
Very good.
Yeah.
Now, something else was happening with the evolution of the PMBOK. It was getting very, 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 very big. And it wasn't going to get smaller. And so they had to actually go back to their original design specifications and say, how can we maintain this growth? How can we continue to add value without adding more pages? And so what they did was a little bit of a pivot. Instead of process groups, they talk about something called principles. A principle is, by definition, something that serves as the foundation for a system of belief. So this is what we believe in. And it's founded with, and it's based on the code of ethics. So this is really what's weird. You have your value system in project management, which structures these principles. And if you read between the lines, and if you read the lines, and if you understand how this works, your values and your principles shape your behavior. So we're getting into the human sciences part of this. We're no longer talking about initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, controlling. That's not going away. Okay, we'll talk about where that's going in a minute, but this is actually shaping the behavior of a project manager, not the actions and steps they take.
So while we have people listening to us who are dyed-in-the-wool, excellent project managers, who are right now shaking in their boots because they think their whole world is turned upside down, we can say that's not the case. In fact, the guide that they're so used to seeing, which was the body of knowledge and the standards, they are still, as you say, within a different arena, or within a different area on the PMI website. but now we are much more kind of concentrating on these, what you call the principles.
And if you think about it, what does the PMP exam test? Does it test our ability to memorize processes? Or
Right.
does it test our ability to behave, think, and act as a project manager? And that's been the way it always has been.
That's good. That's good. So some of these principles, and that's what kind of where we got off on this part of the conversation, when we went from a process-based to a principles-based. And I think for the benefit of our really good project managers out there who are used to initiating, planning, executing, monitoring, closing, et cetera, now we want them to start to think, and they probably have been, but we want them to start thinking of things like stewardship, things like team and how to build that team, things like taking care of our stakeholders. I think you mentioned value a few minutes ago, things like system thinking and leadership. So those are the kinds of, not processes, but principles that we now want to focus on as project managers.
Correct. And again, it's not that much of a pivot, because the 6th edition is talking about what you do and what actions and steps lead to other actions and steps in managing a project. Like planning leads to executing, and monitoring, controlling allows you to change. But we're also talking about the why and the fundamental components of how humans work as individuals and as groups. And so it's broadening our knowledge and our ability to not just, manage teams and manage projects like a cookbook, but to say, if I want a really good cake, these are the variables that I can change. Like one of the principles is tailoring. If I want to do a cake really correctly versus just putting together a cake for a Wednesday night, I can actually look at my quality and other things. And all these things like risk and quality and my resources, they don't go away. It's that we're focusing on our behaviors and how our behaviors shape those actions.
Well, and I'm thinking back to the 24 previous podcasts that we've been working on. We have been much more leaning in these directions. I mean, we've never forgotten about initiating, planning, executing, and all those things. But we've tended to, within that framework, we've tended to look at things like team development, things like, I think we've talked maybe about conflict resolution, about stakeholder management and keeping our stakeholders happy. So I don't think we have ever stopped considering the process-oriented thing. It's just that we have been developing this whole people-oriented, human scientific aspect of our project management approach.
Yeah, and some of the other principles that have been included are really fascinating, that I've been studying on my own, and I didn't even realize that they were important for project management, or important enough for PMI to tuck into a standard like this, like complexity, like adaptability and resiliency. And these are words you hear when you talk about Agile, but not necessarily what you hear in predictive projects. But it's really great that PMI is starting to dig into the details and the components of these principles as well.
And we did talk about a couple of those before when we dealt with emotional intelligence too. So adaptability, and that is part of our EQ as project managers. So it's kind of like all coming full circle. We're not throwing anything away, but everything kind of has its piece, and the puzzle's coming together in this whole process.
Let's go into the guide to the 7th edition. This is where things get really fascinating. I'm not going to go into great detail here, but the guide actually looks at what they call performance domains, which is a group of related activities. Okay, we had related activities like scope, schedule, cost, quality, resource communication, risk procurement, stakeholders, and integration, right? We called those areas of knowledge or groups of skills. And now they're looking at stakeholders, team, development approach and life cycle, planning, project work, delivery, measurement, and uncertainty. Now, let's take that through the list. Let's go sequentially through that list in the guide. You have your stakeholders and your team. So people come first, relationships come first. Development approach and life cycle. That's the first thing you have to really decide when you're looking at a project. How are we going to look at this type of a deliverable? What type of methodology and what type of business considerations do we have to have in place? So what they're doing here with the 7th edition is retooling the body of knowledge in the guide to say, okay, we're going to have to step back and say the project may not be just predictive. We may be agile. We may be agile with iterative. We may be agile with iterative and incremental. And so what we're looking at in the performance domains is a sequential approach to the project life cycle.
So when I mentioned earlier that it seemed to me that the previous versions, the process-oriented ones, seem to emanate from the predictive life cycle or the waterfall methodologies. It seems now like back then when we talked about Agile and using PMBOK 6, the version 6, it was like Agile was bolted on and tried to be made to fit. What you just told me, or what I just heard, is that with this new orientation towards development approach and life cycle, it'll work for either predictive or agile, or perhaps the hybrid. Is that what I'm hearing correctly?
That's exactly right.
Nice.
What they've done is they've gone to another level of detail, more general level of detail. And they said, this is for all projects, all project management, regardless of methodologies. And a lot of this discussion, they reference both predictive and agile life cycles in the PMBOK guide, but a lot of the detail that we had in the 6th edition around predictive and agile, they squeezed out in order to make this guide a little more simple. So it's like being up at 35,000 feet in an airplane instead of 6,000 feet. And we don't need to be as granular specific. What we can do, though, is we can use this guide at a big picture look, and then we can dive into other things as we need them.
Which is where things like tailoring come in. Although tailoring was a feature of PMBOK 6, I think tailoring is now probably one of the principles, right? It's one of the, or maybe not principle, maybe, I'm not sure which one it is.
Actually, tailoring is a principle and it's a domain.
Okay.
So it's a principle. It's a part of our behavior. it's our approach to problem solving and that kind of thing. But there's also, how do you do tailoring? We say this is something that's part of our value set, and we ascribe to this. And then you say, how do you apply tailoring at this 35,000 foot level? So it's sort of one of these that's both a principle and a domain.
Yeah, tailoring was kind of part of what we did anyway, because sometimes we came in to a jurisdiction and they said, we want what that other jurisdiction has. We would pick up code from the other jurisdiction and bring it in, but it still required all of the processes that we talked about before. But we tailored those processes because we had a working version of the system that we brought in. So I can see that. I mean, tailoring is part of what you do as a vendor to satisfy a client, to make sure that you're working well within that client's particular structure, within their domain, within their culture. So yeah, and now that tailoring is kind of front and center in PMBOK 7, I'm liking this even more.
Yes, and it was brought out as a key characteristic. It was in, I think it was mentioned on page 2, and it defines of the PMBOK 6th edition, and it mentioned, here's what tailoring is and what tailoring does. And it allowed teachers like me to stand up in front of a class and say, see, tailoring means that the PMBOK is not a bunch of rules and regulations. It's a guide to good practice. It's like we got together with a bunch of smart people over the last 200 years. And if you do things this way, you probably have a higher probability of success, but your organization may tell you to do something differently.
Yeah.
Or finance may say you can't do it that way. And this has been the nature of projects and project management. But the guide is finally getting to the point where we're not, like you were talking with Agile bolted on the outside. Projects have the ability to no longer be bolted to the outside of business and operations. They can be integrated in.
Which just makes sense. I mean, that's how we live life. We integrate. I mean, we become flexible and adaptable to what happens in our lives. So why shouldn't we apply that same principle to business? And in this case, to the business of managing projects.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
So
we're getting really excited about this. Let me add one more thing. So we have these two guides, 6th edition and 7th edition, right? And we have this big transformation. But we're talking about getting rid of all this information in the 6th edition. And where does it go? It goes to a knowledge base. Project Management Institute created a knowledge base back near the end of 2020, I think is when they first started putting it out on the website. And if you knew where to look, you could actually start playing with it. But they're starting to populate it now with these things that we no longer see in the 7th edition. It's like a box of Tinker Toys. So you have the big user manual for how you make a cake. And then if you have to get into the details of why do I mix the dry components together first, you can actually go into the knowledge base. That knowledge base is called PMI Standards Plus.
So if, I come from a fairly structured, before I went on my own as a consultant, I worked for a couple of the very large system integrators. So we had our own knowledge base in many ways. And this makes a lot of sense, because if I went from one type of project to another, from one city to another, from whatever I'm doing, I could always go back to my knowledge base and say, okay, remind me again how I present a status report. Remind me again how I do a requirements definition workbook. So we always had that knowledge base that didn't subtract from our ability to manage projects. It was just our huge cheat sheet, so we didn't have to start reinventing the wheel all the time.
Yeah, and part of the cheat sheet that we have in PMI Standards Plus are templates. Yeah. Some of them are videos, how-tos. Some of them are webinars. Some of them are other types of content that we can actually go through and say, oh, that's the way it works.
So in this case, we have it, in fact, to set people's minds at ease, those who are listening to us and getting a little irritated with this huge change. It's really not. There is a different alignment, but nothing in 6 has been lost. It's the details are in the PMI standards, and we can always go there for what it is that we need at that particular area in the project that we're working on.
And think about this. While we're talking right now, they've already integrated the Agile Practice Standard inside PMI Standards Plus. They've integrated the Business Analyst Practice Guide, and that's already inside PMI Standards Plus. So this extends the ability. We don't have to have like 12 or 14 PDFs that we're rifling through anymore. It's nice to have the PMI documents, but at the same time, it's great to have a database you can just hit too.
Well, I don't know about you, but rifling through PDFs, I had to first remember which PDF I should start looking in sometimes.
Yep,
because
exactly.
Yeah. So we kind of understand why there's this shift from process to principles and domains. What in terms of what it does for the PMBOK, I'm hearing that it simplified it in many ways. It kind of brought it up one level to a humanistic or human science approach to projects, as opposed to just detailed process. So, and again, you mentioned that a lot of this would allow us to incorporate Agile. So what are some of the other benefits of what we're learning about this new PMBOK 7?
So there's, you know, just from my own personal brainstorming, there's a couple things. This exponential growth in data that we're trying to cram inside the PMBOK through the 4th, 5th, and 6th. It's going to slow that. Number two, it allows us to focus and refine both the big picture structure of projects and project management and the discrete components. And we can actually look at all of these pieces and we can say, you know what, let's lock in this big picture, and they have. And then let's say, you know what, we used to say critical chain is good, then we said critical chain is bad. Let's say critical chain is a thing and put it in this knowledge base and say it's really good for here, and this is what it breaks, and have these really smart project managers go to the knowledge base and have this extended discussion and find out these things that we left along the way. Because what else did we leave? Graphic GERT and PERT, right? A graphic evaluation review technique and program evaluation review and technique. They used to be really good scheduling frameworks, and they had a really unique way of putting risk into the schedule that you cannot do with our precedence diagramming. And so it gives us a platform where we can actually expose this good and bad discussion, and we can explore these things. So maybe we can get even more innovations moving forward and not have to change the general structure.
So Tim, having now gone through that part of the discussion, if I were to look at this, and I don't know how deeply you've gotten into this yet, but let's kind of tease this out. In PMBOK 6, and in my experience as a project manager, let's take the subject of risk. So in risk, you always had this very discrete way of managing risk. First of all, you'd identify it, you'd put it in a risk register, you would assign it to an owner, you would try to mitigate it, or you would, you know, there's several ways of handling risk. So that was very prescribed again. But now risk falls into one of the principles. Have you had a chance to look at how how PMBOK would instruct us now in dealing with the risk aspect of a project?
So let's take the topic of risk, and we're going to break it into 3 pieces. First of all, there's a risk standard that goes outside of PMI, right? There is a standard for risk. And the practice guide for risk management talks about this. And what you do is you identify your requirements, you prioritize your requirements, you take your highest priority requirements in your threshold, and you apply further analysis. That's called qualitative and quantitative analysis. You develop your responses, you monitor and control, and you apply the responses as the risk occurs. So that's the big standard. And that piece, the big standard, is going to slip into the PMI standards.
And that doesn't change.
And that doesn't change.
Right.
But what happens is we can actually look at risk from a what will I call it? A behavioral standpoint. One of the big changes in the 6th edition of the PMBOK was the addition of a risk report. And by adding that project document, you have a risk register that you've always had. And then all of a sudden in the 6th edition, you have this risk report, which says, yeah, the individual risks and their characteristics are important, but we also have a document that says, here's my general project risk, here's my highest priority opportunity and threats. And I have 2 conversations going on. I'm working on the project with my quantification and my analysis of my risks, but I have that communication through my risk report with all of my stakeholders, especially my executives. And so the behavior of risk, which I was just talking about, goes in the standard. And then in the guide to the project management body of knowledge, we have that second part. And here's the how and what of planning risk. And that's part of the project performance domain planning. Here's what risk looks like when the team is doing the work. Here's the delivery methodology when we're looking at risk. Here's the measurement of risk, both as a planning measurement and a monitoring measurement. So we have risk actually applying not just in one of these domains, but apply across all of them.
So that's interesting. If I look back to what we talked about, I think how you defined principle before was it's a fundamental aspect that serves as the foundation for our belief system. Our belief
Yes.
system definitely is project management. We definitely believe we need to maintain and manage risk, to identify it and manage it. So what you just talked about was that hasn't gone away. Those standards are still there. The process is still there. But now what we're looking at is much more of a way of making sure that that's part of our everyday life as a principle that we bring into the project with us. And we share it with our stakeholder, we share it with our teams. We just make sure that everybody is always on the alert.
Yes. And this is the big thing. Okay. I've been working as an approved training partner of Project Management Institute. I had to get certified in how to teach the PMP preparation material that PMI puts together. And 80% of the content I teach from is directly from PMI. And when I first started looking at this training material, PMI's training material all along was saying, look, you know, all this leadership you're doing, responsibility and accountability, you got to teach your team this. And guess what? You got to teach your stakeholders. You're going to have to train your team in conflict management and train your stakeholders in conflict management. And this was coming out in the training material PMI was deploying in January. And now what they're saying is, this is what your responsibility is. We're getting back to that concept of servant leader. I'm creating an environment that says this is the best environment for making that happen. And that's the role of the project manager. And this is, I've been researching that term stewardship, which is another principle, which is fascinating. And it all aligns up with the fact saying it's not just Agile that benefits from training and raising up everybody around you. You're a mentor to the world. The one of the other things that they're talking about in training, and I expect I'll find it, is lessons learned.
Oh, yeah.
Lessons learned are not just for this project. Lessons learned are for this project, the other project, and hopefully for the benefit of the organization itself. And the crisp, clear articulation, not just once, but many times in the PMI training material says, we're trainers, we're mentors. We create an environment where everybody steps in and raises a hand without anybody asking. Everybody jumps in and is accountable, and we work together. And that fits Agile perfectly, but predictive can have exponential benefits from this as well.
Well, and you mentioned lessons learned, and I just kind of threw that risk thing at you out of left field, but I can see where if we're all alert and all working together collaboratively, and we all want the best for bringing the objectives into fruition, into implementation, then I can see where the risk piece of that always ends up as part of our lessons learned. Otherwise, we haven't learned anything.
And there's something else that I'd like you to think about, and everybody in the audience think about this too. The PMBOK previously has had a very interesting discussion of project failure and project success, and the PM ensuring that the deliverable meets the objective has always been a metric of project success. Project success now is aligned not just with functionality delivery, but value delivery.
Hmm.
That's a big part.
Well, and that certainly fits Agile, right? Because Agile tries to incrementally get the most value into implementation sooner than aspects that are of less value.
Yes, that's incredibly succinct. Another piece of that is that we've all had projects where we did them just right and they did not meet what the stakeholders desired. We missed that point. And to the benefit of your statement early in the show here, you can do a project expertly and still miss what's really needed. And this is where the people first comes in. How do I engage my stakeholders so I really understand what value is from their perspective?
I think I actually wrote a blog post on that, and the number one statement a project manager does not hear, and this could happen and often did in predictive, was, I know what I asked for. That's what I asked for, but it's not what I wanted. So you can see where the requirements were perfect, but the intention behind the requirements and the objectives were not captured.
Yes.
So how did, and I've seen it happen. I've heard horror stories of, I know
So
that's what I asked for, but that's not
yes,
what I
so
want.
this actually bodes well for eliminating that issue. This is actually an incredibly beneficial transformation. It's gonna take time to get used to, though, because it's a paradigm shift, and it's not a change in the way we do project management or think about project management. It's a paradigm shift in how we perceive project management and how we behave inside of projects, which is
Well,
almost harder.
well, and maybe it's not so perceptive. Maybe it is physical in some cases, because I've been on projects. I've had project managers who were by the book, project management methodology, PMBOK, whatever the version was at that time. And their thought process behind process was that they stayed in their office with their door closed and made sure the check boxes were ticked, made sure the Gantt chart was kind of progressing, made sure the status reports were perfect. Once a week, they came out to deliver the status report and went back in. I mean, that was and I'm obviously exaggerating a little here, but in certain cases, those process-oriented project managers were detrimental to managing what was required from the perspective of the client. Whereas I'm thinking that and I'm looking at the very first principle, you mentioned it earlier, stewardship. Stewardship is people oriented. That project manager who sits in his office or her office and doesn't engage except through paper and email and status reports is not a good steward.
Let me give you the definition of the 7th edition's concept of stewardship. It's beautiful. I was just thinking about this today. Being entrusted with the care of something, responsible planning, use, and management of resources, and upholding values and ethics. What's wrong and what's right. And that's what stewardship is. It's really general, it's ephemeral, and you can almost not quantify it. It's really hard to quantify. But again, this is what we call our principles. So it's right down the crosshairs of servant leadership.
Yeah, and let me challenge a little bit what you said in terms of quantifying. Again, coming from the vendor aspect, and I did a lot of fixed price projects. As a steward, not only was I required to stay within the budgetary limits of my client and therefore give my client their value for the money they paid me, I was also beholden to our shareholders within our company, because if I lost money on every project, our shares would go down, our stockholders would not like that very much. So the stewardship aspect of a project manager, you had to satisfy both sides. A lot of that was governed by the budget, sometimes they were competing priorities, but nonetheless, you still had that stewardship responsibility in that one area.
So that's fascinating. Let's go back to the talent triangle. What were the 3 pieces? We have the people, which is the leadership.
Yeah. We have the business.
Processes, and we have
Right.
the business.
Yeah.
And in 2015, PMI, by releasing this, said, guys, we need to know more about business, and we need to be further integrated in with the business, or we're going to be an ancillary tool that works as an admin. And by making this change, it allows us to integrate in with business. It's no longer a bolt-on. Project management is no longer a bolt-on or a nice to have. It's a critical component of business success.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in many ways, just think of the example I just used. Not only you're protecting the customer's budget, you're also protecting your shareholders' investment. And sometimes that puts the project manager in the crosshairs of some very difficult situations.
Well, and exactly right. And you think about companies now. Operations is what keeps the business running, right? Yeah. It's what goes the day in, the day out, and it creates cash flow. Now, the business is not going to be able to grow, but they're going to keep running. Projects are change. Projects, by definition and intent, apply innovation. And if a business needs to be competitive, it needs to embrace change. And if we can actually create entire armies of people who understand this concept and can understand how to build it within teams, business has a potential for not just, keeping the lights on, but remaining competitive and healthy. And this is what business have been looking for from projects, not just to patch and fix and keep things going, but actually to innovate and change and grow.
And can I add, not just to make current manual processes faster, because that doesn't really benefit anybody. But you just reminded me, as you're talking about that, from a business perspective, in order for them to grow, a lot of times they will bring in automation in order to allow them to accelerate their growth. But part of we're talking about stewardship. Part of our stewardship can't be just stuck on the customer's budget and our investors' investments. They're also the whole idea of, if I'm automating jobs out, I have a stewardship responsibility to look after those people who are now being displaced. And through my organizational change management process or my business process reengineering, figure out a way, as part of the non-automation piece of what I'm doing, is to be able to rehouse those people into different jobs to again accelerate business and make sure that
that was the illness of the late 20th century.
Right.
The illness of the late 20th century was the whole concept and model of shareholder supremacy, which says, I need to return the money I saved as profit. Money saved is not profit.
Right.
Money saved is potential for future profit.
Yeah.
And this is what we got wrong. And so you're actually talking about very advanced and very current business discussions. We're no longer on the sidelines here. We're right in the middle of solving the problems of our economy. And this PMBOK transition is actually evidence of that. If you want to actually have a value discussion about project management inside your company, this discussion today is exactly what we need to bring up.
Well, it is, and you said it exactly correctly. We as project managers are no longer just the king cogs in the wheel, right? We are actually people who, knowing how automation works, can also guide our stakeholders who are less experienced with automation in terms of not only how it strategically can change, but how they can take advantage of what it is that we're doing to enhance their entire organization, not just the part we're automating.
And from a career standpoint, I'm no longer a frontline manager. I'm no longer a manager of workers. I'm an executive who's a manager of managers. I am strategic. I'm not just that tactical person looking through the checklist and making sure the checklists are right.
Well, we just got onto stewardship, and there's so much more we could talk about, even in that one topic. And I happen to look down at my notes here because you had, oh, in fact, they're on the screen now for those who are watching this as a webcast. But the whole standards, it looks like there's 12 of them there, I think.
Yes, there's 12 standards and there's 10 domains.
10 domains. So we can almost spend an hour on each standard and just kind of dig deeply into what PMBOK 7 means from a from a different perspective of the project manager's day-to-day job.
And what I would suggest is that over the next few weeks, you and I, Merv, explore what the true value of project management is, and then coming back from that discussion, look how stewardship plays in with that. Look how stakeholders play in with that value once we've articulated it.
Yeah, exactly.
I do have one last question for you.
Right.
This is something I've been thinking about ever since 2015. And I saw that talent triangle and I said, they got something cooking here. I know they're onto something, but they're not saying anything. What does this mean? Now, put yourself in the position of 5 years from now and think about what direction do you think that project management and PMI's perception of project management is going based on this transition?
How much time do we have?
36. No. Go ahead. Just play with the idea.
You know, I've thought about this too over the last several years, because I've seen and I'm going to admit this, 40 years of IT system development, much of that as a project manager and as an executive. So I've seen a lot of changes. And on the last couple of projects, I watched programmers no longer code like you and I used to code, but actually do a lot of dragging and dropping. Now, when I grew up in the industry, we got 3 compiles a day, and if you couldn't get your project or your program working in those 3 compiles, you were in danger of losing your job. So we became very, very good programmers. We had very little, and I'm belaboring this a little bit, but we had very little memory space and disk space to work with. So we had to be very efficient, and all of that over time has progressed, so that now with this new dragging and dropping and all of this, people are less concerned about storage or memory and all that sort of. So all of that to say that that our industry has become much more simplified. And I think this new PMBOK 7 kind of goes along with that, because we've simplified the approach. Not necessarily that project management is simple, because it's not, but I think we've kind of looked at a much more simplified approach. And this is where I'm going with this now for the next 5 years. I think that with the dragging and dropping and with some of the new processes that are being put in place, some of the new innovations, just in terms of even developing logical routines, that pretty soon that will be in the hands of the end user much as it's in the hands of our current development staff. And so that also means that subject matter experts and stakeholders may become the project managers of the future. So if I put all of that in context, PMBOK 7, some of our new innovations could end up taking this industry and putting it right in the hands of the customer organization to let them do their own projects without the benefit of these huge teams of IT people.
So my question for you is, what's the role of the project manager in what you just laid out?
I think that the project manager may become much more of a generalist manager, much more of a strategist, much less technically oriented, because I think a lot of the technology is being taken care of by just advances in technology itself. So we may become a project manager of project managers.
So let's think about it this way. Let me paint you a picture.
All
Okay.
right. What's your 5-year approach?
So are you familiar with Lake Como, Italy?
Yes.
Okay, it's a wonderful destination. It's sort of lazy but metropolitan. It's very stylish, and it's culturally rich and diverse. But business is done really weird there. Okay, like you go to get a suit, you go to the tailor's, and you think you're going to be shown a bunch of suits, right? No, he takes you out on the veranda and you're looking over the lake, and he pours you a coffee and he sits, and says, let me learn about you. Let's look and talk with you. Let's figure out what's going on inside your head so I can design a suit that's exactly to your preferences. And they know exactly what you need after that conversation over coffee. And you come back a week later and that suit is perfect. It fits you when you walk, move. It suits the purposes you have for your suit. It's everything you need, and it solves all your problems. And that's what we are. We're actually consultants. We're not just project managers. We're solving problems instead of solving lines of code,
Yeah.
in your words.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's, and quite frankly, from a career perspective, I wish I were beginning my career today instead of 40 years ago.
I hit that thought this week too. These are exciting times, Merv.
It just seems more fulfilling because you're becoming part of the business itself, not just, as a vendor, it was kind of hit and run. You'd come in, you'd develop, you'd implement. Sometimes they'd have you hanging around for a few months to teach their own IT staff to maintain it. And then you'd leave for the next one. And you never really had this as a vendor. You never really saw the benefits of that transformation that you worked so hard at developing. You might call back to your stakeholder a year later and say, how's it going? But you're not really part of it anymore. But this allows the project manager to become part of the business, become part of what's going on a day-to-day basis.
It's and in your verbiage, it's all about the relationship.
Oh yeah.
This
Definitely.
is cool. This is very exciting.
Well, who knew that something as boring as a guidebook could instigate such a stimulating conversation?
Yeah. Well, it does stand to reason. When you're talking about humans and you're talking about, how are we preparing for, not just the next 2 to 5 years before we change the PMBOK, but how are we preparing for the next 2, 3, 6 decades? This is a very exciting conversation. Everybody's curious about that right now.
Oh, exactly. And, if I wasn't so enjoying retirement so much, I might really dig deep. But anyway, so Tim, we're about to close down this particular show. If I have some questions during this week, how can I find you?
Over on LinkedIn. I'm just about ready to launch a new project where you can reach to me in other channels, but still the preferred method is LinkedIn. I'm a little busy. I check it about 4 times a week, but if you leave a message there, you can be pretty much, guaranteed you're going to get some type of a response.
So Tim or Timothy Jerome at LinkedIn.
Yes.
And I'm also on LinkedIn. In fact, for some of these discussions, I'm thinking that maybe LinkedIn is the right place to find us, because then we can bring responses in from other project managers who are kind of watching their chat as well. So yeah, fine. You can also locate me at Merv Jersak at LinkedIn. And I've also got a website, peoplefirstprojectmanagement.com, if you're interested in some of those 156 blog posts on the people aspects of PMBOK version 6.
Very forward thinking of you, Merv.
I hope
You
so.
actually were right on spot with the thoughts as well as the message that you were delivering.
I hope so. And I'm encouraged by PMBOK 7. I'm encouraged what they're doing. And I think you and I have huge fodder for future podcasts and future
Oh yeah.
discussions.
Oh yeah. Conversations over dessert, coffee discussions. And if anybody has any other questions or comments or want us to explore something or bring it to your attention, please communicate with us. We're excited about this, and you can assume that we're going to be talking a lot about these topics. But if there's something you're interested in, we're really happy to bring that into our show as well.
All right. So I can't wait to hear what we are going to talk about next week. So until then, we bid you adieu.
Thanks again, Merv, and thanks everyone for watching.